Um, Welcome to the week 2 lecture, which is the first lecture of the semester, really in practice for PSCI 110, U.S. government, American government. Hopefully, you've read over the syllabus, you've seen what's going on. Let's dive in. Gonna try to not waste time this semester like I usually do with these lectures. I'm gonna try to ideally keep them to about a half an hour a week. That's my goal. Don't hold me to it. But anyway, let's dive right in here. Making sense of government and politics, right? So I will ask a question about this, I believe, on exam one, so pay attention. This is addressed in the Lowy book. Um, Two ways to think about government and politics, right? And actually, two similar ways to think about life in general. Right? We can ask imperial questions about what do we observe, right? What do we see with our own eyes? That's empiricism, right? That's what we call an empirical question. It asks about observable facts, right? That's what we're going to think about on the one hand when we think about government and politics. A bigger, broader, deeper question is why, right? And this requires building a theory of how the world works, right? This is more of a theoretical question. Why things are the way they are is different than what are the things, right? So we can talk about an empirical question versus maybe a normative question, right? A normative question is one that implies judgment, right? Because when we're theory building here, especially about how big picture things operate, we're going to have to make some value judgments, right? We're going to have to make some subjective decisions, things that not all of us will agree are the same, right? And that's really how observing government and politics works. And again, zooming out, it's kind of how life works too, right? Things we observe and why, right? So why do I start with this? Well, the American government book touches on this in the first chapter, number one, this distinction. And I would argue that, I do. I use two books to talk about U.S. government in this American government class. Because the main objective of the American government book is really to provide more of an empirical overview of U.S. political institutions, while the main objective of Katznelson's The Politics of Power book is one that's much more critical. It's a more critical analysis of U.S. politics and government, and it'll better encourage you to ask the question why, right? Why are things like this, and could things be better? How might that be, right? These two books in tandem, I think, work well together in this way. It's not that Lowy is entirely empirical and Katznelson is entirely theoretical, but they work well together for that reason, right? So moving on here, let's ask this big picture question: what is government, right? Government is it's institutions and procedures through which a land or a country and its people, its citizens, are ruled. Right? Maybe we don't like being ruled in the states that are organized. I guess we could put it that way, right? In a democracy, I mean, we are ruled in a way, but it's more organization of institutions and procedures, right? Governments can be pretty simple. They can be like a council, a small collection of people that make all decisions for a bigger group of folks. Governments could be simple in the form of a dictatorship, right? If there's just one person, like in North Korea, that makes all the decisions. Governments can also be quite complex, right? The U.S. system is pretty complex. The U.S. system is not the only complex system of government in the world, right? Brazil, Germany, Mexico, different continents. One shares a continent with the United States, Mexico. These are federal systems. They're large countries. They're made up of states. And as well, they have separate branches of government, like the United States does, legislative, executive, and judiciary. And as I said already, they're federal, right? So they're made up of subunits of government that share power with the central government, like Texas does, like California does, like Delaware does, right, in the United States, right? So again, institutions and procedures and can be simple or pretty complex. We're going to look at the United States throughout this semester, California, always on the back burner. These are systems that are pretty complicated, right? There are a lot of ways for citizens to participate, more than just voting. And throughout this semester, as I tried to stress during week one, when we talked about the syllabus, I really want to encourage you to participate more in this democracy that we live in, right? That's my overall goal. Why is government necessary? Lowy makes three clear points here that I think are pretty difficult to disagree with. There's some overlap here with the first 2 points to maintain order and protect property. But we need order in our lives, right? Without laws, for example, not just to protect property, but also to protect our physical integrity, we wouldn't live very long, right? Necessarily. This first hyperlink here will take you to a cartoonish analysis of the work of Thomas Hobbes, a British philosopher who is very, very, very dead. He lived like 500 years ago, but was one of the first people to put pen to paper and advocate that, we really need to sacrifice some of our freedom in order to enjoy it, right? We have to give up the freedom to, murder our neighbors in order to have that. We all have freedom within this system that we operate, right? Watch that hyperlink if you like. Again, the link is underneath where you found the link to this lecture video in Canvas, or you can crack open the PowerPoint. The hyperlinks are live there as you wish. I just can't click on this now and then post this clip to YouTube, because then YouTube will take it down for copyright infringement. So anyway, maintenance of order, right? So not killing each other, protecting property, an extension of maintenance of order, I would think. But if we can't protect what is ours, then there's no legal system to speak of, and then we live in a country of laws, right? So order, maintaining order, protecting property, and then providing public goods. If we were in class together, I'd ask you, hey, what are public goods? And someone would say, goods that are public, without really explaining what a public good is. The textbook papers over this pretty quickly, but I think it's worth stressing here. Public goods are enjoyed by anyone and deniable to no one, right? So anything from a sidewalk to a public street to a lighthouse, to the protection, the security provided by the military or the police force in a given place, as without going into the downsides of things that militaries and police forces do, but that's another topic for another day. But that security is a public good. It's enjoyed by anyone within the country, within the system, and deniable to no one, right? You can't just shove someone off a sidewalk, right? You can't prevent people from enjoying these public goods, right? And why do I stress this? It's because, how is a government necessary to a public good? Public goods are things that, because they're accessible to everyone and deniable to no one, there's no private interest in creating them, right? Walmart doesn't build roads, right? Home Depot doesn't, build single-family houses, right? These aren't public goods, all right? Well, Walmart doesn't build roads because roads are public. Houses are private things. But my point is, governments are needed to provide these things for which there are no private incentives to do so. There's no profit motive there, right? So watch this link. It's very old. It's very outdated. It's like from the 90s, I think. From South Africa. It's short, but it does a good job of explaining how and why public goods exist, why they're necessary, and why governments provide them. From there, governments can seek to limit what we call free riding through policy and taxation. Free riding is a term we use when folks try to take endless advantage of a public good, right? Roads are public goods, but there are rules that dictate how you use them, right? You can't just drive down any street you want at 100 miles an hour, right? You might want to, and that might be, we could view that as a form of free riding, enjoying a government good for fun, but there's a limit to that, right? So that's what governments do, right? Maintain order, protect property, and provide public goods. Who rules, right? We can talk about types of government. I'm not going to stress the first two heavily. An autocracy, right? Auto means one, and kratos, or the crassy part, means power. So power in the hands of one individual. An oligarchy is, or an example of an autocracy would be North Korea. Again, one guy runs the place. An oligarchy would be a system in which a small group of folks, whether they be landowners, military officers, or a wealthy class of folks, control a political system, right? Some argue that the United States, as inequality increases and increases, that we're slowly becoming an oligarchy of sorts, where money talks, and if you don't have money, you can vote, but you really don't shape policy in a way that you should be able to as a citizen in a democracy, right? A democracy is one in which the people have the power, right? Demos, the people, kratos, power, from the Greek. That's what we think we live in, right? A system of rule that permits citizens to play a significant part in the governmental process. Sounds good. We'll be going through this entire semester thinking about how that happens, how that works. And maybe down the road, week 8, 9, 10, I forget, we might revisit the concept of oligarchy when the time comes. Thinking about forms of government, it's important to consider limits on government power, right? And this is big picture stuff. I'm not gonna, again, we're not gonna have an essay question about this on the first exam or the final to have you flesh this out in narrative form. But just know that in a totalitarian system, right, if the power is total, as the root of the word implies, there's no formal or effective limit on government's power, right? North Korea, again, might be the closest thing to a totalitarian state on the face of the earth. Other countries, I could give you a long list of countries that are authoritarian. These are countries in which there really might not be formal limits placed on the power of government, but there are other social institutions that still have a say. Right? You might have an authoritarian leader of a country who doesn't always get along with the military, and the military might threaten constantly to step in and dislodge the person in power. Right? We could talk of dictatorships, particularly, say, Latin America in the late 20th century, mid to late 20th century, where, yeah, you might have governments that have a lot of power, but still butt heads with either powerful economic interests or the Catholic Church, right? But in either totalitarian or authoritarian states, the people unfortunately suffer, right? They're the ones with the least amount of power in the system. In a constitutional system, say like one in which the United States has a nice constitution, what a constitution does is it establishes what the government's powers are and how they're limited, right? So formal and effective limits are placed on government power, right? And I think that's a pretty good thing, right? A constitution helps maintain freedom of the individuals, right? Of the citizens within the system, right? Because again, a constitution sets out what the rules of the government are and how those powers of government are limited, right? And that's something we'll be thinking about throughout the entire semester as well, right? Why do we obey government? Because really, in any form of government, whether it's totalitarian, authoritarian, or constitutional, governments have the means to make us do stuff, right? The means to coerce us. They can make us serve in the military. They can make us serve on a jury. They can make us attend school, and they can take our money, right? Collect revenue, right? They can tax us. This is how governments pay for public goods, right? Like a military or a court system or schools or roads or lighthouses or stoplights or what have you. All of these things are public goods. And unfortunately, no one likes to pay taxes, especially where I live now in Texas. That's for certain. But we have to do this, right? It's part of the social contract of sorts, right? We contribute monetarily to benefit from what the public goods that governments provide. Why do we obey? Why do we run off to war if the government asks? Why do we serve on a jury if the government asks? Because if we don't, there's a penal system that we also pay for that will punish us, right? If we do not, right? So again, trade-offs between citizens and government, right? And just because there is a penal system in a democracy like the United States, doesn't mean we can, is evidence that we can't just do what we want, right? Freedom has limits, clearly. Let's shift gears and think about what is politics. There's a subsection of the chapter here, chapter 1 of Lowy, that deals with this decently, I guess. Conflict, struggle, cooperation, and collaboration over leadership, structure, and policies of government. Right, that makes sense. What I have in quotes here goes back to the mid 20th century. Some now I'm sure dead fuddy-duddy political scientist quite simply said politics is the study of who gets what, when, and how. And I think that really is almost a more concise and better answer to the question, what is politics, right? That definition has stood the test of time. And folks like me throw it out there at the beginning of every semester in a low-level political science class because it makes sense. Um, but anyway, politics can take many forms. In class, I would leave the hyphened subpoint hidden for a second and ask you what forms does it take. Pretty much, the first thing anybody ever says is voting. From there, what are you voting for? People running for office. But there are other things you can do that are political in nature that don't coincide with what we call politics today, or what we think of as politics, the bad word politics that we don't like, right? We can join groups on anti-social media, social media, or real groups with real people. We can join political parties. We can try to lobby the government. Businesses do this formally. We can lobby the government as individuals by contacting our elected officials, telling them what we would like to see, what policies we would like to see, and why. And just speaking to friends and neighbors can be viewed as a political act, right? And you don't even have to be trying to convince them of anything necessarily, but just talking to someone about what the hell's going on can be, if the subject is political, that can be a political act, right? This class is arguably political. I don't mean that in the bad word way. I'm not here to tell you what to think or to get you to think like me, and your grade obviously doesn't depend on that at all. But we're going to be talking about the political world, and that's a political act, right? There we go. I'm not going to be taking sides. I'm not going to make any of you take sides about anything in particular. But this still becomes political, right? Big picture question here. Does American democracy work? Again, this will be a theme throughout the semester, but it's a good question to ask at the outset, as Loie does in chapter 1 here. And it's a fair question because there's obviously many inconsistencies and contradictions, right? A point to come back to perhaps when we watch the first film, 13th, in a few weeks. Think about the inconsistencies and contradictions in how American democracy works or doesn't, right? There are things the Constitution says that don't seem to work out in practice, right? That's for certain. And before you even think about that, think about, as Loie wants us to do, to think about how we delegate authority, right? We are the principals in this system of ours, in this country of ours, and we elect agents to represent us in the political realm, right? So our political sovereignty is qualified by our willingness to offload governance responsibilities onto professional agents or professional politicians, right? That's the bad word, politician, right? So our sovereignty, our autonomy, collectively is turned over to some folks who make decisions for us within the confines of the Constitution, right? They can't do what they want because of the Constitution, right? But for this to operate effectively, we're to trust government, right? That leads to a question of legitimacy, right? Governments, democracies really, although all systems in a way, depend on whether or not the people who live within them view them as legitimate, right? I think questioning electoral results, which has happened in recent years, is evidence of an erosion of legitimacy in the eyes of certain people who do that, right? We have to have some faith in the system. We have to have some faith in how our electoral systems work so that we can have faith in the people the agents who we elect to make decisions for us, right? And these are important things. And when we go around questioning everything, that can erode the legitimacy of the system and our trust in it, right? I'll leave that there for now, but this will be something that we're going to think about off and on throughout the semester. What about problems with the principal-agent relationship? Question mark here. What happens when those who represent us collectively don't look like we do collectively, right? Think about the fact that Congress, and we'll do this, I think, in week 5, how Congress is overwhelmingly white male, old, overwhelmingly lawyers, overwhelmingly Protestant, with larger numbers of certain religious minorities overrepresented than others. We could look at the Supreme Court has 9 justices. I want to say 5, 6, maybe 7 of them are Catholic, right? Now, the percentage wise, we don't look like that. We're not 70% Catholic in the United States, right? So there are a lot of ways we can think about the principal agent relationship. One topic that has been very hot since 2015 or 16, going back to the run up to the 2016 presidential elections. There's a lot of talk about the working class and its support for Trump, and a lot of assumption that the working class was overwhelmingly, middle-aged white guys with hard hats and such. And that's not really the case. This hyperlink will take you to a satirical clip from a show called Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. She's a comedian, satirist, political commentator of sorts. And she goes and talks to a bunch of working class people who aren't middle-aged white guys. And it's an interesting discussion. I would consider having a look at that if you're interested in such dichotomies. But anyway, I'll continue on here. Trade-off between freedom and order, right? I've touched on this a little bit. The question becomes, is coercion necessary to enable liberty, right? I think I've made that pretty clear, right? There are things, and then we stop and think about this. It makes sense, right? I mean, I'm not free to drive as fast as I want wherever I want. And if I violate those rules, I could lose my privilege to drive, right? Does that mean I lose my freedom? Not necessarily, right? We all need to be free to drive around and get to places, point A to point B safely, right? So yeah, I mean, there is an obvious trade-off between freedom and order. Coercion is necessary to enable greater liberty for everyone, right? But that, in effect, could be viewed as an inconsistency, right? Why can't I be free to just do whatever the hell I want? Well, because your freedom ends where mine begins, right? We could think about the instability of majority rule, right? In a democracy, the majority is supposed to decide things, right? Great. Is what the majority wants always best? No, right? Clearly not. I mean, we can think of lots of examples where, in U.S. history, where the majority was perhaps in favor of enslavement or in favor of women not voting, right? Just until very recently, it was illegal around the whole country, very recently in the historical sense, for same-sex individuals to wed, right? And the majority was okay with that. Was that right? I would say no. So I think it's easy to say that the majority doesn't always want what's best, right? Which can be a real fundamental inconsistency within the democratic system. How about this? What about the 2016 elections, right? When it was this guy versus that woman, and a lot of people weren't happy about those choices, right? So, I mean, these were folks who democratically went through a primary process to earn a nomination to run for an office to represent all of us. But what happens when those possible agents aren't really liked by a majority of voters, right? Well, I think that's part of what eventually led to some erosion in legitimacy and trust in government that we see today, right, in the 2020s, right? And I'd even say that the 2020 election, presidential election between Trump and Biden was another example of a choice between two folks for which the majority of voters likely weren't super thrilled. That's not to disparage Trump or Clinton or Biden directly, personally, necessarily, but that's the way it is, right? I would argue that's our electoral system exhibits yet another inconsistency in American democracy. But anyway, we can flesh this out as we meet later after you watch this down the road. So there's an inherent tension between representation and governance, right? Add to this, not just people we might not like for political reasons or for personal reasons. How about the role of money in politics, right? I use this photo here, Voters Not Donors, because particularly the Katznelson book is going to stress, it's going to be pretty critical of the role of money in politics, right? That corporations can donate millions of dollars to political campaigns. Wealthy individuals can donate millions of dollars to political campaigns, practically anonymously nowadays. to try to influence policy, right? To influence government decisions that affects us all, those of us who don't have millions of dollars to donate to political parties, to political action committees, to political causes, etc. Right? Um, some of us say, well, that's just the price of freedom, right? We're free to flood the political system with money. You could make a case that might maybe another worthy inconsistency of U.S. government might be to limit the freedom to donate so much money to political causes so that we can all have a better say in the system. That's my take. Again, you don't have to agree with me on that, but we'll talk about the role of money in politics throughout the semester, off and on. Katznelson will do so more head on. Most lectures won't be this divided between one and the other, Katznelson and Lowy, or Lowy and Van Vechten. I try to fuse the two, but as these two, we're reading chapter 1 of both books right out of the chute. I'll deal with Lowy, and now I'll deal with Katznelson, and I'll try to pick up the pace a little bit. But if you've read the Katznelson chapter, hopefully you found it interesting. If you haven't yet, hopefully this will make you consider reading the chapter. He starts off by comparing the Titanic to the United States. Not predicting an ultimate crash and sinking of the United States necessarily, but in this way. Katznelson wants us to consider how class and wealth determine how you start and how you finish, right? And in the case of the Titanic, those wealthy folks on literally on the upper decks of the ship started the trip better and were much more likely to survive the crash, right? The fact of the matter is there weren't enough lifeboats throughout the Titanic for everyone to float away safely, right? And it was the wealthy who had easier access to those lifeboats, right? If you've seen the Titanic movie that was made likely before you were born, I had to see it twice in the theaters because I had two sort of girlfriends in 1997, and it was awful seeing that movie twice. But you know that there weren't enough lifeboats, right? Parallel realities to today, we got a lot of inequality in this country, right? And in the United States, it's really almost persistent beyond class too. Some of us who start relatively poor in the United States can accumulate a lot of wealth, but a lot of wealthy folks will still look down on those who do as being lower class, right? But inequality is a problem in the system, and it does really shape how you start out in this country when you're born and how you end, right? Wealthier families have better access to healthcare. Children have better access to doctors. They then live longer lives. Wealthier people are less likely to die in childbirth, and so on and so forth, right? And the reality today is that the welfare state, right, the support that the government provides to those who don't have as much wealth in this system is increasingly smaller, right? When we get there, we'll talk about welfare reforms under the Clinton administration, but there are less government programs to help people who need help nowadays. At the federal level in a lot of states, maybe not so much California, but the government support there is increasingly smaller, right? So inequality is getting worse. Government help is lessened, and so I do appreciate this comparison to the Titanic and to the United States. And I think things are getting worse for those who have the least in the United States. Anyway, you don't have to agree with that sentiment, but that's how I feel, and we'll talk about this on and off throughout the semester. The difference here is that the Titanic was, of course, not a democracy. Right? The captain wasn't elected. The captain was responsible to investors, not to passengers. And business always puts profits before patriotism. Please don't believe otherwise. Any advertisement you see about some company being super patriotic, it's to sell you something. It's not because the business is actually patriotic, right? And the bigger picture question, more related to U.S. democracy, that I might ask is, again, back to money in politics. When our agents seem to be more responsible to those who donate to their campaigns, and they put those campaign donations above what's best for the country, that's when we have a real problem in the system as well. Okay, so a lot of different ways to question what the government is doing, and whether or not it's a good thing, right? Because all these things are done in our name. I don't mean to poo-poo democracy. I'm a fan. Um, I don't love and appreciate how everything democratic works in the United States. I think things could work differently. I've lived a lot of other countries. I grew up between the United States and Spain. I spent a lot of my 20s in Spain. Then I spent a lot of my 30s in Portugal. I lived in Turkey for a little bit in my 30s as well. So I've lived in a lot of other democracies, and I do appreciate democracy, and I appreciate democracy in the United States. And let's think about some of the positives of it, right? Expansion of suffrage, right? What is suffrage? The right to vote, right? That's expanded over time, over a long time, needlessly long amount of time. I freely recognize that, but we've marched in the right direction, right? Most adults are free to participate in the system. Most adults over the age of 18 have the right to vote, right? And I think that's a good thing. At the founding, it was only white males who owned property, right? A lot of folks like to stick with the white and the male part, but it was class as well, right? You needed wealth to vote. And that sounded democratic to certain years at the time, but that we know today wasn't democratic, right? So we need to expand the suffrage on the right track. Our public authorities are accessible, right? My European friends, they scratch their heads sometimes when I say, "Oh no, I'll be there in a minute. I'm writing an email to my senator." Like, why would you do that? Well, because I want to tell this person what I think about something, right? We can do that in the United States, and it's not in every democracy that's such a thing. Rule is not arbitrary or unaccountable. I have here, I think, recent. Um, Political goings on post 2020, 2021 and beyond have led me to wonder sometimes if rule is arbitrary and unaccountable, but it shouldn't be. The law should apply the same to everyone, right? And that wasn't always the case either, clearly, right? And we'll talk about that when we get to the first film. Debate is generally not restricted. We can say critical things of the government, of the president, of whomever, and we don't expect the door to be kicked down by the police to take us away for what we say, right? We can be critical, and that's a good thing. Our democracy has grown over time. I say not without great struggle and sacrifice. The textbook makes the point, but whether that is the Civil War, the suffrage movement, women's suffrage movement in the very early 20th century, the civil rights movement in the middle 20th century, the LGBTQ rights movement in the later 20th century into the 21st, right? Democracy has grown slowly and not as fast. We haven't progressed as well or as fast as many would say we should have. But that's the idea. We're marching in a decent direction, I would say. Not at the pace that we should. But again, we're heading in the right direction, I think. To the point that the U.S. became for a time a global beacon. I question that today in the 2020s. But there was a time, particularly after World War II, that the United States, as a superpower, a democracy, an economic powerhouse, became a role model of sorts for a lot of other countries, rightly or wrongly. Right? I'm not saying that that's a great thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing per se, but it's a thing. But democracy in the states, in the U.S. hasn't always been perfect. Worth reminding ourselves, and I'll paper over this pretty quickly because we'll talk more about this in Lowy's chapter 2. But the first Constitution of the United States was called the Articles of Confederation, which you probably learned about in high school. It failed. It was way too individualistic for the states, right? It gave too much power to the states. And that's what a confederation does. It has a much weaker central government than a federal government, which is what we have now, right? Because when you have different states with their own currencies, their own militaries, their own foreign policies, this made it difficult to exist as a unified country, right? But the Articles of Confederation were meant to negotiate diverse interests and to make it difficult for any one interest to monopolize the system. For example, the Congress, there was a Congress under the Articles of Confederation, but for any decision to be made, it required states to act in unanimity, right? So to all agree, every 13 states, and as they grew, the idea was that they would all agree on everything to make any decision, right? And that quickly The founders realized that wasn't going to work. 10 years later, we get a constitution, the constitution that we have today, right? Why has it been successful? I put it in quotes because we could identify problems with it, of course. But it's been more successful clearly than the Articles of Confederation. Why is this? Well, these things that, again, we'll be thinking about fleshing out throughout the semester: separation of powers. So we have different branches of government, right? That can all check and balance each other because their power is separated, right? So the Congress, the president, and the judiciary branch all have certain control over each other, and no one branch can monopolize the system. Add to that we live in a federal state, right? So we have states that have their interests, and we have a federal central government that has its interests. The Constitution is meant to reconcile those interests and to make clear where the federal government can act and where states governments act. But this has long been a delicate balance between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which we'll talk about more in Chapter 2 of the Lowy text. But the Federalists at the founding were ones who were in favor of a stronger U.S. central government, and the Anti-Federalists were the ones who were more in favor of states having more control over the central government, right? The Anti-Federalists were the ones who were probably more cool with the Articles of Confederation, or having a constitution that more mirrored the Articles of Confederation than our Constitution currently does. But anyway, these are things that have meant to share power and keep it in check, right? The idea here, the quote I have from the text: it's a set of institutions designed to adjudicate among conflicting interests while advocating a public interest, right? That public interest is ours as citizens. And we have a set of institutions, right? The presidency is an institution. Congress is an institution. The Supreme Court is an institution. And these things have to work together to make decisions, right? On our behalf, right? How to determine who governs. I'm not going to dwell on this. I really wish this was a separate chapter in the Katz-Nelson book. Again, we'll deal with these details more specifically in Chapter 2 of Lowy. But all I want to stress here is that at the time of the founding, the drafting of the Constitution, there was tension among the states. Bigger states, larger states by population, wanted that difference in demography, in population, to be reflected in the legislature. Smaller states like New Jersey, which geographically isn't tiny, it's not huge, at the time was much smaller by population, wanted states to have the same amount of power in the House and the Senate. Connecticut, which is a small state and at the time was relatively populous, as it's not comparatively today anymore, but it proposed the system that we have today, which is a House of Representatives whose composition reflects the population of the states, right? So California has over 50 representatives in the House. My home state of Kansas has 4 because the population is proportionally that much smaller, right? That's the system we have today. Thank you, Connecticut, I guess. The problem, of course, at the time was how to determine population. And as I alluded to earlier, problems with the U.S. Constitution. How about enslavement, right? Because in the Constitution today, the text is still there. That African Americans counted as 3/5 of a person in determining the population of a given state. So that was to pad the population of the slave states, the southern states. And of course, those people didn't have a right to vote, obviously. So, again, lots of problems to define. But there it is. How about determining who governs in the judiciary? We'll talk about this. I think week 8 is the week we talk specifically about the court system, but you should know, as a citizen, as a resident of this country, members of the Supreme Court we call justices. They're appointed by the president, approved by the Senate. That's how that works. Lifetime appointments for all federal judgeships, not just at the Supreme Court. And the court was designed to resolve constitutional controversies, right? To do the things you see here: decide when federal or state law applies when there's a conflict, judge how rights are understood and protected, and to settle land and territorial disputes, which really isn't a thing anymore so much. The rest of the court system hierarchy beyond the Supreme Court has been created by Congress and is not defined by the Constitution. We'll talk about that when we get there. How about the need to determine who governs the executive branch, right? The president, right? Which was a new thing. The Articles of Confederation didn't provide for a president, so it was really institutionally, the central government was really institutionally weak. But the decision was that we needed um, a president to govern, but we needed that figure to be nowhere near as powerful as a monarch, right? Because that's why folks started crossing the Atlantic initially, right? To get away from monarchies. Presidency today, a president can serve 2 4-year terms. Presidents do things, we know this, manage foreign affairs, the commander in chief of the military, oversees federal bureaucracy, and has the right to veto legislation decided by the Congress. The president deciding who is the president is indirectly affected by the makeup of Congress in its form as the Electoral College, right? So each state has as many electors as the sum of its members of Congress. So larger states like California have a lot more votes in the Electoral College than like my home state of Kansas. But this is relevant to consider here when we look at some data, say, of the presidential electoral college results of 2008, right? So red states voted for the Republican John McCain, blue states voted for Democrat who became President Obama here. And you can see the Northeast overwhelmingly blue, the West Coast overwhelmingly blue, Florida at the time blue, southern states pretty red, the Midwest kind of divided if you look at the Midwest more broadly, red and blue. The Mountain West, we call here, overwhelmingly conservative, red, Republican. Things change over time, right? People move, attitudes change. And by 2016, again, with this imperfect choice to make between Clinton and Trump, you had a lot of people in places that had been blue for Obama 8 years prior that decided to roll the dice on Trump, right? Nothing wrong with that superficially, right? That's the voter's choice. But things can change, right? This is a fact of life. And you can see that the Electoral College count for Trump was 306 to 232 for Clinton. 4 years later, ironically, the numbers were the same, 306 to 330 or 232. This time, the 306 for Biden. And you can see that states like Arizona decided to change sides. Florida had already gone for Trump in 2016. Georgia was a big surprise in 2020, voting for the Democrat in the election. Wisconsin, Michigan as well switched back to the Democratic Party, and so you have it, right? But we'll talk about the Electoral College in greater detail when we get to the presidency, the chapter on the presidency. But again, the determining the numbers in the Electoral College has to do with the House and the Senate, because this number here is like for the state of Texas represents 36 members of the House and 2 senators, right? And the way it works for 48 of the 50 states is that the person who wins the presidential vote in that state wins all of the Electoral College votes, right? You should know that, hopefully, having gone to high school and hopefully being a voter in the system. But anyway, that's how we determine who's president, right? It's not a direct vote for individual A or individual B. Moving on, as I'm going longer than I wanted to, we can talk about the Bill of Rights. We will superficially, well, we will in greater detail, I think, in the next week or two. But this was insisted upon by the anti-federalists, so those who were skeptical of the central government power, federal government power. So this Bill of Rights was meant to provide clear definitions of freedoms for the individual and to more clearly restrict the federal government, right? So the First Amendment to the Constitution gives us freedom of speech, of religion, of the press, etc. 2 to 4 restricts what the executive branch can do to us. 5 to 8 restricts the judiciary branch. And then 9 to 10 of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, worth reminding ourselves, spells out what rights are reserved for the people and the states, which are not assigned to the federal government, right? So the founders, with the second time around after the Articles of Confederation, were really trying to reconcile all of these competing interests, right? Of the federal government, of state governments, of citizens, and so on and so forth, right? So we can think about the system itself, right? It's a great system, seems to be. So that's the end of it, right? Why bother? Why bother even moving on from here? Well, we should think about the standards of democracy in determining whether or not that democracy is a great thing, right? So this is Katznelson's take on the inconsistencies in American democracy, of U.S. democracy, right? Katznelson wants us to think about democracy not just by its formal procedures, but how they work in practice, right? Police brutality shouldn't exist, shouldn't be a thing, right? No one should be above the law. So, since this is a problem in this country, that might be indicative of the fact that the procedures don't always work as they should, right? And that's just one example of thinking about police violence. How about thinking about capitalism? Right, because Katznelson, as you can see, is going to be a little critical of free market capitalism, but the founders, in effect, created this. Right, the Constitution does not mention capitalism; it doesn't talk about a market economy at any point. But what we have is a capitalist system that exists within a democracy, and the bigger picture question I have for you, as Katznelson maps out his corporate complex to be a bit critical of the capitalist system within our democracy, because the capitalism isn't really democratic, right? It isn't. It's not at all, right? Companies become too big to fail. Views of corporations are unevenly represented in public debate. This has a lot to do with the role of money in politics, I would argue, and I'm not the only one who does. Right, the notion of majority rule is confined to a limited range of questions that's often shaped by corporate interests, right? Corporations don't like those of us talking about higher corporate tax, right? Or being critical of the tax system itself, right? Corporations like to be able to do their thing, sell us stuff, often great stuff that we need, but they don't like us to think about how corporations can influence the political system in ways we can't, right? And when you look at this is from the Katznelson text directly. The information is increasingly dated. This is from 2012, but you can see, over 10 years ago, what the biggest top 20 Fortune 500 companies were and how much money they had to play with, right? Because this is revenue in billions of dollars, right? That's a lot of money. And if you look closely here, a lot of these are energy companies, a couple of automakers, Walmart's there, of course, banks, Verizon, bastards, Citigroup, more bastards, but a lot of money to throw around, money that you and I don't have, right? And corporations can use that money to shape the democratic system. Right. So, bigger picture question to ask: should a democratic system be measured by fair and open elections, or by the control and distribution of resources? Another way to ask this: what should the relationship between capitalism and democracy actually be? Okay, this might be something for us to think about when we reconvene next week, or depends on when you watch the video. Another question to think about, which I think I'll bring up when we get there: how should a democracy look or function? I would encourage you to have a look at Katznelson's definition on page 18 of the text there of chapter 1 of his book. I don't have it in front of me right now, and if I did, I don't want to look at it because I'm over the time I wanted to take. But let's focus on this when we reconvene via a screen shortly. Okay, we'll do that. Other questions to keep in mind here. These are big picture questions. These are things I really want you to think about even years from now. Do the country's representatives reflect the characteristics of the people they formally represent, right? I'd say no, right? This is the principal-agent relationship, to bring it back to Lowy. Are representatives aware of and responsive to their constituents' concerns? I would say, yeah, to an extent, but no, clearly, not entirely, obviously. How does a democratic system work amid inequality of resources, right? How, or a way to reword that: can inequality of resources become a threat to democracy itself? Okay, things to think about. I'd like to talk about these when we get there. when we're together via a screen. I'll remind you, or well, I'll throw out here a quote from page 20 of Katznelson. Extreme inequality blocks the full achievement of a fully realized democracy in which all citizens have chances to influence the making of decisions that affect them. Right. So we know Katznelson's answer to the question. Your grade, of course, is not going to depend on agreeing with him or agreeing with me. I think this is a suitable quote. That's why I put it in the PowerPoint slides. But reasonable people can have different answers to these questions. Okay, so let's think about them and talk about them when we get together. I should have just cut these slides out, for Christ's sake. But we can talk about political change. We will do this throughout the semester too. I'll be very quick here. I did not want to go this long. I apologize. After World War II, I mentioned this earlier, when the United States became a beacon of sorts for the globe. The United States was the world's only superpower and set out to prove it. Right? We've got 700 military bases around the world in 28 some countries. We spend a lot more than the next lots of countries combined. Well, we'll talk about this in greater detail at the end of the semester. I'll say nothing more right now. But the biggest military in the world that the United States has protects the world's biggest economy, right? So this combination of military and economic power underpins U.S. influence in international affairs. And I think this is where the global beacon has started to become the global bully to an extent. Going back to, war that began perhaps before you were born, but went on well in through most of your lifetime in Iraq, right? The Middle East, the United States has been criticized very heavily for throwing its weight around, right? Not being a beacon, but again, being a bully. But how has the pursuit of security changed how we live at home? Again, I think post September 11th, without going into great detail, I could give you lots of examples of how we, again, had to sacrifice certain freedoms to try to live more freely in the face of an external threat, right? When I first started flying as a kid, it was a lot easier to go through security than it is now, right? I'll leave it at that. The aftermath of September 11th has changed how we go to the airport, right? We're less free there. But that's in order to be freer in the long run, right? Let's think about political change domestically, at home, within the country. Katznelson warned us in 2014 when this book was published a long time ago, nearly going on a decade ago, that polarization was going to be a problem, or already was a problem then, right? So when students tell me that this polarization is really new, I say, no. It's actually not. We actually go back to the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists if we wanted to. But polarization is definitely a real thing, and I think it's getting worse, and I think it's a threat to our system and in the long run, conceivably, our way of life. Moderates in both major parties are endangered species, and I think this is another part of the problem, right? I'll leave it at that. I don't want to keep talking. I've gone on too long. What shapes the gulf between the parties? So what drives polarization? It's not limited to these things here, but we can talk about race, class, gender, orientation, religion, culture, etc., language, a lot of things. And it's not uniform. It's not that if you're of one class or of one race or of one gender, of one religion, that you're going to ipso facto think a certain way. No, but we can see patterns. And that's what political scientists look for in the empirical data, right? A couple of links here. Lastly, just to sign off. There's increasingly little room for compromise in the era of identity politics. This is a story from National Public Radio, an audio story you can listen to and or read. I think it's a white conservative Christian couple who adopted from abroad a non-white child, or a couple of them, and came to learn, better understand the folly of some of their assumptions that they had about the U.S. society and political system. I'll leave it at that. The last point here, this us, not us versus them, is an interview between two non-journalists interviewing each other. Millennial types, maybe Gen Zs. I forget how old they were in the story, but African American man, white woman, just talking about the differences. And it's worth a listen. It's constructive. I mean, I'm not going to give you anything that's not constructive, but things to think about, right? And that's what I just want you to do throughout the semester. Start just thinking about the political world around you and how it works, how it doesn't, how it works for you, how it doesn't. I'll leave it at that. Again, I've gone on for longer than I wanted to. My apologies. I'll try to be shorter in the future. Goodbye. See you soon.